Hi, everybody. It's Tori from Avalon Enchanted. And I wanted to bring you folks the next installment of where I'm going to be going next. We already covered some historical information about the Luxor temple. So today we're going to actually be exploring information about the Avenue of the Sphinxes and how that plays an important role. We're actually going to be going there on the second day. And it's actually a really interesting story. So I'm going to be covering information about that today. So for those of you that haven't heard, my name's Tori McNally, and I am going to be heading to Egypt in January. And when I was in Egypt last year, I actually outlined my trip, basically posting live video chats, videos, answering questions, and things like that. So this time I'm going to be doing the same thing, but I thought I would give people a little bit of a historical background on the individual sites. So that way you know what we're talking about when we're actually there at the individual places. I just realized I have squash on my shirt. Anyhow, not going to worry about that. So, we're going to start out by talking, like I said, about the Avenue of the Sphinxes. So the Avenue of the Sphinxes is actually an area that is between, it's actually between the Karnak temple and the Luxor temple. It's actually there on the West Bank in Thebes. And those two temples are connected by I believe it's like a 2 mile or so avenue, which is lined with all sorts of Sphinx statues. Now, interestingly enough, when you get to the area of the actual Karnak temple, when you enter, you see rams and sphinxes kind of lining up along the way. So that's kind of like the tail end of where you enter, a grand entrance. So let's talk a little bit about that now. The length of the road is actually 2,706 meters, and there are benches and places to sit, which is good. So people have the opportunity to basically walk the same pathway that ancient Egyptians walked. This was actually a pathway where not only the priests of the temple, but also kings and queens would use that, or I should say pharaohs, and their queens would also use this information. So let's dive in a little bit more. So there's actually a couple of areas of the Avenue of the Sphinxes in Luxor. Like I said, they basically did it in 2 days. And the Sphinxes were once connected to the temples of Luxor and Karnak, where priests and royalty and the pious walked in procession to celebrate the Opet festival. Now, what is the Opet festival? It is basically a very, very special festival. In October of last year, they actually reopened this particular walkway, I guess you could say, to celebrate the two temples coming together. So it took 5 years of restoration in order to be able to restore those, in order to restore that avenue. And when I was there, and we were at the Luxor temple last time, they were just getting ready to have this big ceremony and to open it up with a ceremonial procession. However, unfortunately, we weren't able to be there. So on the annual Opet festival, priests basically walked the stones from Karnak to Luxor, and they would be bearing a wooden bark holding the shrine of the triad of deities. those particular deities that they would walk with, or I should say follow, were Amun-Re, Mut, and then I know I'm going to butcher this, Kohonsu. And like I said, it did take a lot of time in order to restore this particular avenue because it was just so important. But interestingly enough, like I said, it's 2,700 meters long, and the span of this particular avenue, they had to do some major reconstruction to it. So interestingly enough, we had a number of different archaeological digs going on, as well as preservation, in order to come up with a way of finding out more about that particular avenue and also restoring it as best as they could. It was actually divided into 5 different excavation sites, and they kept on finding sphinxes pretty much all over the place. When they first started, they unearthed 650 sphinxes of the original 1,350 sphinxes that were supposed to be there. A lot of the times, many of them were actually reused during the Roman period and in the Middle Ages. So many times, some of the temples or chapels or areas were recycled, because remember, we have such a long line of history in ancient Egypt. They found a number of Roman buildings and workshops that manufactured all sorts of different goods like clay pots and statues and reliefs, things like that. They actually found a relief that bears a cartouche of Cleopatra, and they believe that she was likely visiting this avenue during her Nile trip with Mark Antony, which is kind of interesting. So needless to say, remains of Hatshepsut's chapels were there, and they reused those in the 30th dynasty. And they basically spent a good amount of time allowing everything to be rebuilt. So the number of rams on both sides of the road, because it's lined with these rams, is 1,059 statues. Only 30% of the restoration and installation of the heads have been finally completed, but some of the rams are still missing a part of their heads, or they don't have a head at all. So they're in the process of still working on it. What are some of the other interesting things to mention? This was something that was really celebrated when they actually made this procession in ancient Egypt. Like I said, you had the priests, you had the priestesses that were working, or I should say walking down this particular avenue to celebrate these 3 particular gods and goddess. And they felt that these 2 particular sites were very, very tied together with this particular avenue. And I bet you, if we looked on a map, I wouldn't be at all surprised if there was a ley line that probably went underneath those 2 temples and went along that particular avenue. Just throwing that out there. So what are some of the other things that I wanted to talk about with this particular temple? Let me see. Bear with me for one moment. I have some of my historical notes up here, so just want to give us all of the right information. So construction of the Avenue of the Sphinxes began during the New Kingdom, is what it was called, an era, and was completed during the late period during the 30th dynasty. So we're talking about 380 to 362 BC. The road was later buried under layers of sand over the centuries, and the Avenue of the Sphinxes, like I said, kind of slowly went away with the way things were in terms of how the sand was moving around and so on. So the Luxor road is buried and couldn't be excavated because it lay below groundwater level, whereas Karnak, nearly a kilometer of it is visible. So we have some interesting things. They actually found the first trace of the avenue in 1949. And that was when an Egyptian archaeologist discovered 8 statues near the Luxor temple, with 17 more statues uncovered later on in 1958. They unearthed 55 statues from 1961 to 1964. And from 1984 to 2000, the entire route of the walkway was finally determined, leaving it to excavators to uncover the road. And the original 1,057 statues are along the way, and they're divided into 3 different shapes. So the first shape is the lion's body with a ram's head. And those were part of an area that was between Karnak temple and the precinct of Mut. So that was part of a temple there during the reign of the ruler of the new kingdom of Tutankhamun. The second shape is the full ram statue, and that one is built in a remote area during the 18th dynasty, which ties in with Amenhotep III. Now, interestingly enough, it's thought that Amenhotep III became an ascended master, who we now know as Serapis Bey. So these ram statues were built during the 18th dynasty of Amenhotep III, but this was before things were being transferred to the Karnak temple, or Karnak complex, I should say, because originally Luxor temple was considered the main hub of ancient Egypt, and slowly things started to change around a little bit. So the third shape, which includes the largest part of the statues, is the statue of the Sphinx, which is basically the body of a lion with the head of a human. And the statues extend over a mile to the Luxor temple. So like I said, last fall, actually November 25th is when they actually reopened the avenue to the public. And they concluded that restoration work that took over 7 decades to finish, believe it or not. People were able, they did this, like I said, this large production where participants dressed up in ancient Egyptian pharaoh clothing with a symphony orchestra and lighting effects and professional dancers all made their way down the avenue, walking, horse-drawn carriages, etc. And again, we talked about how this was dedicated to the sun god, Amun-Ra, I should say, the moon god, Konosku, and the mother goddess, Mut. And they were all carried by men in sheer gold and black robes, which was meant to be a replica of what would have been worn during that same festival in ancient Egypt. So needless to say, it certainly was very much a strong and impactful vision that was created as a way of celebrating and reopening this avenue of the Sphinxes. So some call Luxor the site of the largest open air museum, and certainly is the largest archaeological site in the world. And it definitely tells a lot of stories from 2000 BC all the way up until Roman period. So, like I said, it is walkable and runs between the 2 temples. And it is something that I'm really excited about seeing. So I am glad that I'm going to be able to actually be on that avenue. The sacred road was once named the Path of God, like I said, connecting the 2 temples of Karnak in the north with Luxor in the south. And they were paved with sandstone blocks that lined both sides. So it was very much a production, which was very important with ceremony and honoring the gods, honoring the goddess, because certainly in ancient Egypt, so much was worshipped with the elements, the sun god, the moon goddess, I should say the moon god, and then also the goddess of the earth. So I hope you enjoyed this brief talk about the Avenue of the Sphinxes. We're going to be doing Karnak Temple next, and that's going to be a really interesting video because we're going to talk about a little bit about some of the different things that are there, as well as get into more about the chapel of Sekhmet. It's actually the chapel of Ptah, who was Sekhmet's consort or husband. So, but there is a very large black obsidian, black statue, stone statue in this particular chapel. And there's a lot of energy that is in there. So we'll talk about that in our next chat. So have a wonderful evening. Take care. And hopefully you'll join me on the journey. Bye.